Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Steve Wells, and I want to talk to you about a reinvented future. And I want to talk to you about a reinvented future that has mindset and leadership challenges at its heart, rather than the technology that lead to them. And the reason I want to do that is that I think future-proofed organisations do work on these three horizons in parallel. So we know we need to win the race for the current year. We know we need to bring things into land. We know we need to achieve the tactics, the operational objectives we've set ourselves for the current year. Most organisations then do the piece of work that says, so where's the growth? Where are the things, the opportunities, the risks we're looking for over the next 1 to 3 years? Maybe some kind of strategic plan. Maybe what's less common is then really taking ourselves high so we can see above the horizon, really looking into the future, really trying to understand what the future drivers are. Whereabouts are the weak signals? Whereabouts are the things that we can see if we look for them, but maybe we don't realise that they are there until we do. So I think I just want to set a little bit more context as well, because one of the things that we're starting to see, and maybe we have seen some of these for some time, is a whole bunch of new and existing major forces that are starting to shape the future. Now, a lot of those will be familiar about the changes in society, maybe demography, the way that technology is changing. But for me, the really interesting ones are very much about what do we do about uncertainty? What do we do about increasing complexity? What do we do about the pace and scale of change? What do we do about this notion of exponentiality? So as well as maybe just the technology changing, we have this raft of other changes that sit around that. One of the things that really resonates strongly with me in the context of those drivers are notions around sustainability. And I really like this model of the 17 sustainability goals from United Nations, because what they do for me is they broaden the idea around sustainability. They take it beyond thinking about the environment, thinking about life on Earth, life in the water, and they start to say, what do we need to do to be sustainable and eradicate poverty? How do we need to create sustainable economics, sustainable business models? How do we need to think about things like gender equality? So a whole plethora of things now that we're thinking about and that we're being encouraged to think about around sustainability. And one of the other notions that I think we're seeing that's particularly important in the context of mindset and leadership is this idea of two worlds colliding. So many of us come from a very analog and a physical world where we understand how to make things, we understand how to provide services. We kind of get used to the idea that technology represents a very useful tool for us. And that world's starting to clash with a very digitized world where data is actually the real currency, data is actually the real value. People in this world have grown up with technology, they've grown up from a very young age thinking about social media, thinking about connectivity in maybe a very different way than people from the analog world have done so far. And this idea that there's an explosion of science and technology developments across an enormous range of different domains. So in the past, maybe what we've seen is 1 or 2 new technologies that come to the marketplace and have a very fundamental change on what we do, be it the steam engine, be it the discovery of electricity, be it desktop computing. What I think we're seeing here is a whole range of different and potentially collaborative type technologies that give rise to a very different environment. And maybe this is one of the issues that's behind the notion of exponential change, and particularly exponential change that's driven by some of these technologies. And here's my real favourite example of how some of these technologies are starting to change not just the industry that they're focused on, but related industries as well. So local motors are really challenging these markets, manufacturing, supply chains and logistics. So how are they doing that? Well, they're 3D printing cars, which in itself is quite an innovative idea. But when you realise that they're looking at around about 2,500 to give a payback on a factory, and that compares to maybe a traditional car manufacturer who's looking at 50, 60, 75,000. So that automatically starts to question not only component supply chain, but also the idea of where you manufacture, how you manufacture, where do you move the finished products to and from. So maybe this starts to represent an opportunity for very much more local and regionalised manufacturing. That also then changes logistics, because if we're just thinking of this about cars, what are other areas of technology, what are other areas of the economy could we apply 3D printing to? The other thing that I think is really interesting about local motors is this notion of combining different technologies. So Ollie on the right hand side there is a 3D printed autonomous bus. And you can get on board this bus, you can have a conversation with it, what's the weather like, where am I going, what's the best place to go and eat burgers. So this combination of 3D printing and artificial intelligence is potentially changing the way we could even move around our cities. These products, by the way, you can buy them now. One of the other things that particularly strikes me, and I'm deliberately not going into any depth around artificial intelligence, but when we start to think about the potential for artificial intelligence and its way of automating not just the way we produce things, but maybe the way that we interact together, maybe the way that we interact as people, maybe the way that we can automate what we think of as white-collar services. This starts to challenge our notion of what might our workplace look like in the future. What happens if the normal humans amongst us are competing for jobs with enhanced humans, maybe with robots, maybe with androids, maybe with other types of technology-driven manifestations in the workplace? How do we manage to compete with a humanoid robot that doesn't demand holiday pay, doesn't demand time off in lieu, doesn't end work at 5:25 when the normal workday finishes? We start to get a sense here of how potentially the workplace might change. There are a number of really interesting studies about the impact or the potential impact of automation, and I really like this because I think it sets the argument up really nicely. So broadly speaking, will networked automated AI robotic devices have displaced more jobs than they create? Round about half the people say yes, half the people say no. So there's a degree of uncertainty that's already built into the argument. What I do find interesting here, though, is that although they're coming at it from different angles, there are some really interesting challenges for society generally. So if we do end up with automating more jobs than we create, then what's the impact on society then? Do we face social breakdown? On the other hand, if we do create more jobs than are lost through automation, what are the social structures that we need in place to account for that? Education being one of them. How do we train people to work with these new technologies? So when we think about those things, for me it sets up a mindset challenge. We need to do something different, don't we? Because if we play by the rules of the game, then we're into a situation where if you always do what you've always done, you always get what you've always got. But I'm not so sure standing still is an option. Standing still is tantamount to going backwards. Because on the other side of this, you've got people who want to create a new game, people that are looking to do things differently, people that are looking to disrupt what's happening right now. And maybe the companies I would think of that sit on opposite sides of this are people like Kodak and people like Blockbuster, who sit on the play by the rules of the game side. Now I find Kodak a particularly interesting example because maybe they didn't make one mistake and they made two. So they didn't believe that a player from Japan would come in and steal their market share because they had this enormous faith in their consumers. And they also discovered a digital camera, then canned it because they didn't want it to cannibalise their film business. On the other side there, you've got people like Uber and Airbnb. But their process, their way of bringing their ideas to market is really quite simple. Start with the consumer in mind, put themselves in the shoes of their consumer, their customers, work out what it is they really value, deploy some technology to deliver that, then think about the business model that allows all that to come together. Now I think there's a challenge there for existing organisations, for big organisations. Because how do we change our organisational DNA when actually we're completely invested in what's given us the success that we've enjoyed to date? And I think this sets up a real leadership challenge. And the leadership challenge is in part around this notion that we're moving from a situation where we can generally be fairly close to agreeing what the issue is, and we can be fairly certain about the things that are coming down the track. So we can adapt, we can adopt what we think of as ordinary management type techniques. So the problems there tend to be relatively tame in nature. But maybe this complexity and the pace and scale of change is actually taking us to a place where we're far from agreement about how we handle the issues, how we come to solutions. We're certainly far from certain about the way that the future may play out. And maybe that's taking us into a realm of wicked problems, problems that are very social in their nature. We possibly don't even understand the nature of the problem. So I think there's a new skill set that maybe we need to think about. And maybe what we need to try to do is to think about building mindsets and skills, maybe for the co-creation of new offerings, maybe working with different stakeholders than we've tended to do in the past, because there are a range of different leadership skills that we're going to need, foresight being one of them. The way that we're curious, how do we use that curiosity? How can we think about foresight? How can we think about relationships? How can we use scenarios and make sense of the world that we're heading into? Not just so that we can develop one strategic response, but maybe so that we can develop a range of strategic responses, robust strategic responses, flexibility into our strategies. I don't think anymore it's about one solution. I think it's about creating a sense that we can change the solution as we start to evolve. And I think for me what's really critical is that if we think about this stuff, if we think about what we mean by leadership and what we mean by being leaders, then we really need to walk the talk. We really need to be the change that we want to say and see, that we want to see in the world. Thank you.